Hello everyone, I'm Andy Forsyth with Sioux Specialties. For those who know me, I tend to do most of my work with feathers, like some of the stuff you see behind me. But today I'm actually working on some beadwork, and I thought I would share with everyone a little bit about how I do beadwork with real sinew. Working on a different project today, a pair of moccasins on brain tan these are Arapaho moccasins circa 1880, and just for the fun of it, I thought I would do them in the original style of methods of construction. So I'm using real sinew, not of course the imitation sinew. When I talk about sinew, I'm talking about the real sinew, the tendon that comes from deer, antelope, elk, bison. This is backstrap sinew. I process all on my own. Whenever I hunt every year, I pull this off when I'm butchering and then scrape it, clean it, dry it, and you get a nice piece of sinew. This one's plenty long, but this is actually short compared to those for deer and elk. This one is probably antelope. Now what you need to do, of course, in order to get usable threads like these are some prepared threads that I have for beadwork. They're all nice and thin. You need to work the sinew to break it up a little bit. There's a thin layer of fascia that runs cross grain to the long threads, so you want to work it in your fingers a little bit to loosen that up and get those threads separated. Doesn't take a whole lot of work. As you can see, this is already starting to break apart. I can't unroll it. There we go. You can see there's some threads. I have another piece here I've spent a little bit more time on and ready to pull out some threads from that. It may take a little bit of practice to gauge what size thread you need, one that's not too big, not too small, just the perfect thread. Of course, if it's too large, it's going to be hard to put the beads on. If it's too thin, it'll break, and you don't want that. And once you get your sinew pulled down to the size you want it, let's get rid of some of these. There we go. Yeah. You need to moisten it. As you get the sinew moist, and this is really one of the easiest ways to do it, you get it moist, and then I'm going to roll it along here, and allow me to turn the camera down in my work area. While that's wet, just roll that a little bit, and then I'll twist it up into a nice tight thread. And once you have it twisted up, hold it for a few seconds as it starts to dry. And as you could see a minute ago, I tend to go through and I just make a bunch of threads, do a dozen or more, and have them ready, lay them aside as I get ready to do my beadwork. That way, as soon as I stop, I don't have to spend time doing another thread and then continue beading. I just keep going. Even when I'm working with a regular beading thread and beading needles, I do the same thing. I'll prepare half a dozen needles with thread, wax them, and get them ready to go so I can just keep moving. Now, many of you may be familiar with how people used to use real sinew, and in a traditional method, they would use an awl to punch a hole through the leather. I would recommend, if you try this method, use a smaller awl, one that's made perhaps from a glover's needle. This thick awl for heavier leather is a little bit tougher to get through for just beading. So there we go. Again, that takes a top stitch. I didn't go all the way through the bottom. That just takes a top stitch. And a top stitch when you're working on brain tan, which is what this is, top stitch is what you need. The threads don't show on the back side, the threads don't rub and wear, and that's pretty tough. That top stitch on good brain tan will hold. Now, I have not worked with the commercial brain tan or German brain tan. I do my own brain tan for the deer and antelope that I hunt. I don't know if the commercial stuff works quite the same, but from what other people have told me, it seems to do pretty well, uh, having the same qualities. One of the things you cannot do is take a top stitch on commercially tanned deer skin. They keep the upper grain or epidermis on the skin and use chemicals to break it down to keep it soft, and you try to take a top stitch on that, those threads will pull out because the fibers of the hide won't stick together properly. Now, I showed you the awl, but in fact, what I do is very simply nip off the end of my thread, a nice point here, and I'm going to use just a sharps needle to work on sewing. Pull that through and twist it. You can use this. I will simply run that through the leather. It's a lot easier putting the needle on instead of working the awl when you're trying to get down real close. You still need to make sure you work on keeping the thread moist. So of course I'm going to use a little bit of saliva. That works very well. Now what I'm not going to do is do the very end that goes through the needle. You want to keep that stiff, but the rest of it, go ahead and soften. I'm going to try my best videoing myself here to make sure you can see exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to take my first stitch parallel with these rows, and I have just a little leather fob with some beeswax on it. Rub some beeswax on, that helps me get a good grip on the needle. As I pull this through, but not quite all the way, I have a small tail. Now I take the second stitch, starting about halfway through, that is, say, in the middle of my lane. I'm going to take that out to the edge where I want the bead to start. Push that through with my leather. Of course, as I pull that through, I have this nice loop. Before I pull that down, I pull the tail from my first stitch through the loop and then cinch it down. That traps this tail right in the middle. And then I fold it back, and that's all it takes. You don't need to tie a bunch of knots. While you're working with the sinew, that it is moist, you don't have to worry about tying knots. While it's wet, it's soft and pliable. As soon as it dries, it's going to become hard and stiff, and it's not going to wiggle back through while it's stiff like that. Now, as I take my needle off this other end, this again, you want this to remain stiff, so you can use this just as you would a needle to help you pick up beads for working. So very simply, keep this part stiff, moisten the rest of it. Use my fingers there. One trick that I like to do, very simple, put just the smallest dab of glue there we go. Elmer's glue is good enough. I like Elmer's glue on my finger, and then rub that on the end, twist that up, and then let it dry. That'll help keep that end nice and firm. Twist that into a nice point. So as that stays stiff, you can use that for your needle to pick up your beads, and it will very easily go through the eye of your needle to stitch it. So I take one more stitch here, get on some beads. Now this process takes a little longer than normal beading thread and beading needles. So I wouldn't necessarily say everybody needs to do this, but it's fun to try something a little different. And for those who enjoy doing things in an historical perspective, perhaps you want to work on something uh, for a craft project just for fun, doing something as recreation of something, or perhaps you're doing on some restoration work. Very simply, it's fun to try, but really not something I would say everybody has to do. But for those that want to try it, hopefully this is helpful to you. Again, once I put on that needle, I can take my stitch, pull that through, and lay down my beadwork, pull it snug, and keep moving on. I expect, and I would suggest most likely, if you try this, plan for your work to take maybe 3 times longer. And if it only takes you twice as long as using regular beading needles and Nymo thread, I'd say you did a great job. And if you get down to where you're only taking 1.5 times longer, I'd say you are probably doing master level work if you're doing that well. Again, it's not something everybody has to do. It's fun, it's interesting, doing a little bit of research to see how Native people used to do things. But Native people throughout history and still today use modern materials, what was available to them. As soon as needles were available, why continue with an all-in sinew when a needle with cotton thread or linen thread was easier to work with? Same thing today. I would say if it's something that you really want to do because you enjoy it, you want the experience, do it. For the self-satisfaction, these 2 pieces of beadwork that I've done, the moccasins and the strike-a-light pouch, these have both been beaded in an old style with some antique beads. One of them with real sinew, one of them with modern thread. And frankly, just by looking at them, you really can't tell the difference. So the idea of using real sinew is great for the experience, but it's more the self-satisfaction. This pair of Arapaho moccasins, I'm doing them this way because I want to. And so I encourage you, give it a shot if you would like to try it, but I would say don't ever let anybody make you feel like you're less of a craftsman or beadworker because you don't do it the old way like they did 150 years ago, because very few people do. But in any case, I hope this was helpful, and keep looking for a few more videos. I'll try to post some things for some tips as I come up with some ideas. Thanks, and have a great day.